The suit, the body cast, I started with those 5 months prior to the beginning of the film.
Remember when a murdered Detroit cop came back as a silver-plated crime-fighting machine and somehow became one of the most unforgettable action heroes of the 1980s? Well, released in 1987 and directed by Paul Verhoeven, RoboCop starred Peter Weller, Nancy Allen, Ronnie Cox, Kurtwood Smith, and Miguel Ferrer. What looked like a simple sci-fi shoot-'em-up turned out to be part satire, part corporate nightmare, part resurrection story, and one of the smartest blockbusters of the decade. But behind the scenes, making it was almost as chaotic as old Detroit itself. A fired star, explosions that got out of hand, and an endless war with the ratings board. So today we're going to count down 15 weird facts about RoboCop. And stick around for number one, because the suit that everyone remembers took roughly 50 rejected designs to finally get right. And the director eventually admitted that the delays were his own fault. So grab your Auto 9, report to OCP, and hit like and subscribe. It helps YouTube show this to more retro fans like you. All right, dead or alive, y'all are coming with me. Let's get into the countdown. Number 15, Peter Weller was actually fired during RoboCop. Now, you've heard the Hollywood cliche, nobody else could have played that role. Yeah. But anyways, with RoboCop, the line was kind of actually true. Not just for the reason you'd think, though. By the middle of production, Weller and Verhoeven were at each other's throats. Weller had spent 4 months with a mime coach. Yeah, you heard that right. Moni Yakim building a movement style for the character. Precise, mechanical, nothing like a standard action hero. Then, the suit showed up and torched all of it. The armor was so heavy and restrictive that he could barely move, let alone pull off the routine that he had drilled for months. In 100-plus degree Dallas heat, sweating off 3 pounds a day, inside of it, tempers finally boiled over. Producer Mike Medavoy made a call and fired him, shutting production down while they scrambled for a replacement. Lance Henriksen's name got floated, and if you've seen Aliens, you can picture how different that RoboCop would have been. But then reality stepped in. The suit had been molded exactly to Weller's body, so recasting would mean rebuilding a large chunk of that costume at a cost that nobody wanted to eat. So after all the shouting, Weller came back. He and Verhoeven shook hands, and they spent 2 solid days reworking how he moved until it finally clicked. The funny part is, the suit had shaped the casting long before it started torturing him. Orion's top choice had been Schwarzenegger, fresh off the Terminator, until somebody drew the armor onto his frame and then realized that they had just built the Michelin Man. The role needed a bit of a leaner guy. It needed Weller, which makes it extra rich that the thing that he fought every day was the same thing that handed him the part, and nearly took it back. Number 14, RoboCop only exists because Verhoeven's wife read the script. The guy who directed RoboCop almost never made RoboCop. When the script first landed on Paul Verhoeven's desk, he wasn't really impressed. He dismissed it as a dumb action movie and just passed. And then he passed again. And from where he was sitting, it looked like another violent shoot-'em-up. A robot cop, corporate villains, a lot of explosions. Boring, case closed. But before the script disappeared for good, his wife Martine picked it up, and she came away with a completely different read. Where Verhoeven saw bullets and exploding squibs, Martine saw the thing buried underneath all of it. A man who loses his identity and spends the whole movie trying to claw it back. She locked onto the emotional chord that he skipped right over. And once she pointed that out, the whole thing flipped. What he'd written off as a straight shoot-'em-up was suddenly a story about memory and identity. You feel it later in the movie, when Murphy wanders back through the home that he used to share with his wife and kid. Nothing left but a cracked best dad in the world mug. That's the soul that Martine spotted, and he'd blown right past. And just like that, he was in. Thankfully, Martine saw what he didn't. Otherwise, RoboCop could have ended right where Murphy's old body parts did. Discarded and kind of forgotten. Number 13, Paul Verhoeven said that RoboCop was an American Jesus. How's my Dutch? Not great. Anyways, for years, most of us filed RoboCop under one heading. Cyborg cop shoots bad guy, and Paul Verhoeven would like a word. We remember the crashes through the walls, of course the body count, criminals meeting the business end of an Auto 9, but Verhoeven will tell you that there's a lot more going on under the armor. He openly said that Alex Murphy's whole arc was built as a modern-day Christ story. He flat out called RoboCop an American Jesus, and once you hear it, it's weirdly hard to unsee. Now look at the shape of it. Murphy gets brutally executed, stripped of his old life, and then comes back from the dead in a new form and slowly pieces together who he used to be. Verhoeven compared the killing to a crucifixion and the comeback to a resurrection. And he didn't stop at theme. He tucked a visual wink right into the climax. As RoboCop closes in on Clarence Boddicker in the steel mill, he appears to walk on water. No accident. Verhoeven did it on purpose. A nod to exactly who you think. As kids, we were locked in on that ED-209 tumbling down the stairs and Boddicker finally getting what he had coming. A cyborg shoot-'em-up running a Sunday school subtext the entire time, and nobody in the audience blinked. Really only Verhoeven. Number 12, RoboCop wasn't rejected 11 times. It was only rejected 8. Oh, spend any time around RoboCop fans and you've heard that stat on repeat. The ratings board rejected it 11 times before it landed an R rating. Quoted everywhere, but there was only one problem. The guys who made the movie say that that's wrong. Both Verhoeven and co-writer Ed Neumeyer put the number at 8. 8's still a lot, though, of course. The board kept bouncing the film for its violence. Murphy's execution, the ED-209 boardroom bloodbath, the moments that made audiences gasp and laugh in the same breath, and the irony that Verhoeven loved. The cuts made it worse. The gore was built as cartoon excess, so over the top that it would kind of loop it back into comedy. Trim the absurdity, and what's left just reads as grim. The censors set out to make it less shocking and accidentally made it less funny. The cut that finally did it? Murphy, still human, getting his arm blown clean off during his execution. A wire gag that Neumeyer thought looked corny anyway. That was the trim that tipped RoboCop to an R. So, yeah, it went to war with the ratings board, just not 11 times. It was 8, by the count of the guys that were actually in the room. Number 11, RoboCop's hand cannon was just a souped-up Beretta. That oversized pistol that RoboCop whips out of his thigh and empties into bad guys, right, the Auto 9, that looks like something cooked up in a weapons lab decades ahead of its time. It's actually just a Beretta 93R, modified until it stopped resembling anything that you could actually buy. They stretched the barrel and capped it with a big machined compensator that, fittingly for a movie about a guy who comes back from the dead, was shaped like a coffin. Flip it to a 3-round burst, point it at Clarence Boddicker, and that little casket on the end, it spits fire with every pull. Subtle? It was definitely not. But the holster is the part that nobody notices, though. Those shots where his thigh splits open and the gun rises to meet his hand, that's not the suit. That is a standalone polyurethane leg, pulled from the costume's own mold and filmed as a close-up insert. Worked by 3 crew members on a 2-phase cable rig, one panel swinging back while the holster pushes out on a bearing. So the single coolest move that RoboCop's got was actually just a detached robot leg and 3 guys yanking cables just out of frame. It's gotta be like the world's most heavily armed puppet show. Number 10, RoboCop originally didn't end with Murphy. You know the ending. The old man asks his name, and after losing his body, his job, and every shred of who he used to be, the answer is one word: Murphy. Cut to black. One of the best closing beats of the decade, but it almost didn't end there. The original cut would roll past Murphy into one last media break, the same fake newscast gag the movie opens with, revealing that Officer Lewis had pulled through and was recovering in a hospital bed. And it was a slick piece of work. RoboCop is built as a near-perfect mirror, opening on a newscast about a cop fighting for his life and closing on one about a cop who made it, with Lewis even firing a villain's own smug line right back at the camera to seal the symmetry. It's beautifully constructed, but completely unnecessary. None of it mattered, though, because the movie was already over. When test audiences hit the boardroom scene, they were screaming, "Murphy!" before Weller could even get the word out. It was the catharsis that they waited the whole film for, and nothing was ever going to top it. So the filmmakers did the hard thing. They took their own clever, symmetrical ending and just threw it in the bin, letting the movie land on the single word that counted. 40 years later, and people still quote it. That mirror-perfect hospital scene landed exactly where you'd expect, scrapped right alongside Murphy's old body parts. Number 9, one RoboCop explosion was so big that the cast thought that they might die. They were out on location, filming Clarence Boddicker's gang blowing up a row of storefronts. One of those fronts was rigged to detonate. A routine enough movie stunt, in theory, but the explosion didn't quite get that memo. When the charge went off, the blast came in way bigger than anyone had planned for. Big enough to send the actors standing nearby diving out of the way. One of them was Kurtwood Smith, Boddicker himself, who walked away with the most memorable souvenir of the day. The blast set his coat on fire, and he had to ditch it mid-take while it was actually burning. Movie sets are full of people who tell you years later, "Oh yeah, that was kind of dangerous." And this is one of the rare times that it was true. Verhoeven remembered the aftermath plainly. Once everyone realized that they were still standing and mostly unharmed, the mood was basically, in his words, "Wow, we survived." That's not exactly the line that you'd want after a routine effects shot, but it got serious enough that the actors involved each pocketed an extra $400 in stunt pay. That's Hollywood's polite way of saying, "Hey, sorry we accidentally blew you up, now we'll buy you dinner." Nobody got hurt, and the cameras never stopped rolling, so that scramble that you can spot in the finished film, that's not a performance. It's actually a cast that's genuinely thinking that this day, it may be their last. Number 8, RoboCop was secretly driving around in his underwear. Now, so much for RoboCop being the ultimate unstoppable crime-fighting machine. Remember all those shots of RoboCop climbing into his cruiser, looking cool and intimidating and totally mechanical? Well, it turns out that there was a bit of a problem. he didn't actually fit in the car. The suit was so bulky that Peter Weller couldn't sit behind the wheel in full costume. And when you've spent a fortune building a futuristic police car, well, the star physically can't get in it is not exactly the note that you want from the set. So the production landed on a very Hollywood fix. Whenever RoboCop had to drive, Weller wore only the top half of the suit, and from his waist down was just his underwear. The most feared law enforcement officer in all of Detroit was basically cruising the city looking like he'd given up halfway through getting dressed. Obviously, they couldn't let any of that show, so they framed each shot to protect the illusion. When RoboCop would step out of his car, the camera tended to catch his robotic feet first, selling the idea that he'd been in the full suit the entire time. And it worked. For decades, most of us never suspected that under all of that armor was an actor steering around in a skivvies. Hey, quick question before we get to the second half of this countdown. What's your favorite RoboCop moment? ED-209 in the boardroom, Clarence Boddicker stealing every scene, or that final Murphy ending? Well, drop it in the comments, and if you're enjoying the quick trip back to old Detroit, hit like and subscribe. Now, come quietly, or there will be trouble. Number 7, old Detroit was actually Dallas. RoboCop sells you a decaying futuristic Detroit so completely that most of us never thought to question it. The crew never set foot there, though, because nearly the entire movie was shot in Dallas. And the reason was money. Verhoeven had a $13 million budget and no real room to build a sprawling sci-fi city from scratch. So instead of constructing the future, he went hunting for a place that already looked like it. Dallas, with its glass towers and sharp modern skyline, did the job quite well. Look close and the disguise slips. That's Dallas's ball-on-a-stick reunion tower lurking in the background of Detroit. The best stand-in is one that you never guessed, though. OCP's towering, menacing headquarters. The corporate cathedral where Dick Jones sneers down at the city is actually Dallas City Hall, designed by I.M. Pei. In real life, the place is a grand total of just 7 stories tall. The filmmakers slapped a matte painting on top and then stretched it into a skyscraper. So the seat of all that corporate evil power was actually a mid-sized municipal building where people would go to pay their parking tickets. Number 6, the grossest scene in RoboCop was almost cut. Ask fans for RoboCop's most unforgettable moment, and a lot of them land on email. The toxic waste meltdown, the candle left in the sun look, and the car. The whole thing, it nearly got deleted. Effects artist Rob Bottin called it the melting man, a wink at a 1977 horror cheapie that he'd cut his teeth on. The Incredible Melting Man. Well, the MPAA took one look at it and told the producers, lose it. It's too graphic. But the problem was the test screening had already spoken. When researchers asked audiences which moment hit them the hardest, Melting Emil came back as the single most popular scene in the entire movie. It's tough to argue something's too much for the crowd when you have the data saying that it's their favorite, so it stayed. And the single grossest image in the whole sequence was a fluke. When Clarence's car finally splatters Emil, his head comes loose and rolls in a clean arc straight across the windshield. And that part was never engineered. The dummy was built to lose its head on impact, yeah, but nobody could have choreographed it that way that it tumbled into frame. The most stomach-churning shot in the entire movie, and they landed it on pure dumb luck. Number 5, ED-209's terrifying voice came from the producer. Now, for a machine that spends most of the movie barking threats and malfunctioning spectacularly, ED-209 has a strange little origin story, and it starts with a recording that was never meant to survive past the first screening. When the production needed a voice for ED-209, producer John Davison stepped into the booth and laid down a rough placeholder. Just a scratch track to be replaced later. That was the plan, at least. But the filmmakers, they played it back, and they kind of loved it. And Davison's temporary take became ED-209's actual voice. One of the most intimidating robots in movie history, courtesy of the guy producing the film. He didn't even put his name on it either. To this day, the role is still listed as uncredited. The growl is its own rabbit hole. The version that you hear most often is that it's a Jaguar growl played backwards, but the film's Foley team tells it differently. According to the people who actually built ED's sound, that roar was a straight, unprocessed recording of a furious black leopard. No reversing, no studio trickery, just a very big and very unhappy cat. Oddly fitting, too, since ED-209 stalks, growls, and throws tantrums like an apex predator the entire movie. The voice came from a producer who never signed his name, and the roar, depending on who you ask, came from a leopard having a genuinely bad day, or maybe a different big cat played backwards. I don't know. Sometimes movie magic is simpler than it looks. Number 4, Kurtwood Smith made Clarence Boddicker even scarier. A lot of what makes Clarence Boddicker so unforgettable was never in the script. Kurtwood Smith kept improvising on set, and Verhoeven kept letting him run with it. And the best one lands at the police station. After RoboCop hauls him in, Boddicker gets shoved up to the booking desk, and he spits a mouthful of blood across the sergeant's paperwork. That's not scripted. Smith and Verhoeven had loosely agreed to do something to liven the moment up, but the blood was Smith's call in the take, and that's the version that made the movie. Now, the part that sells it, though, is that nobody warned the other actors. So when you watch the cops recoil, especially Robert Duquesne as the desk sergeant, that revulsion, it's not really a performance. They're reacting to a guy who just spat blood all over their desk with zero heads up. Sometimes the scariest thing a villain can do isn't pull a trigger, it's make everyone else in the room genuinely uncomfortable. Number 3, Nancy Allen almost never played Ann Lewis. Ann Lewis is the soul of RoboCop, Murphy's partner, his closest ally, the one person who never stopped seeing the human being under all of that armor. But originally, Nancy Allen wasn't supposed to play her at all. When production got going, the role belonged to Stephanie Zimbalist. She'd already been cast. She was expected on set. But then Hollywood did what Hollywood does. Her show, Remington Steele, got called back for another season. So her contract yanked her back into it. And just like that, RoboCop needed a new Ann Lewis. So in stepped Nancy Allen. And once she was cast, Verhoeven started reshaping the character in an unusual direction. Action movies of that era weren't exactly famous for nuanced women. Yeah, they were love interests or damsels or set dressing, while the hero did all the work. But Verhoeven wanted Lewis to read as an actual cop, so the first thing that he went after was her look. Allen's long blonde hair got cut shorter and then shorter again several times over until there was nothing glamorous left. The haircuts weren't about a makeover, they were about credibility. Audiences had to buy Lewis as Murphy's partner, not the standard issue movie girlfriend. Allen met him halfway, and then some. She wore men's underwear on set to get into a tougher, less feminine headspace. And she leaned hard on her own father, Eugene, a real New York police lieutenant, to make the performance ring true. For a role that she nearly never landed, Lewis became the heart of the whole movie, the one who kept insisting that there was still a man inside the machine. Number 2, RoboCop's gun spin was a love letter to his kid. Watch RoboCop finish off a magazine and then twirl the giant pistol before dropping it into his thigh. It reads as pure machine showing off, but it's the most human thing that he does in the entire movie. It started with a kid on a couch. Murphy's son was hooked on TJ Laser, a cheesy TV cop who spun his gun every time he holstered it. And one day, the boy looked up at his dad and asked if he could do it too. So Murphy taught himself the move. Not for a case, not for the job, but just so his kid would have a reason to think that his old man was the coolest guy alive. He told Lewis as much. He did it because he knew his son looked up to him, and he wanted to be worth looking up to. Then Boddicker's gang turned him into spare parts, OCP wiped his memory, and that should have been the end of Murphy entirely. Except the spin survived. At the firing range, fresh off being rebuilt and erased, RoboCop empties his weapon and, with nobody programming it, twirls the gun and holsters it. Lewis watches and goes pale, because she's seen that exact move before. That little flourish is the moment that she realizes that the thing inside the armor used to be her partner. A corporation scrubbed his whole identity and missed the one piece that mattered. Turns out you can erase a man's memory, but his soul is still going to be doing party tricks. And number 1, the RoboCop suit almost looked completely different. Now, it's impossible to imagine RoboCop looking any other way. The silver armor, the visor, that stiff mechanical walk. It's one of the most recognizable character designs in movie history, really. But getting there was a nightmare. Special effects legend Rob Bottin went through roughly 50 different designs before anyone landed on the RoboCop that we know. 50! Sit with that. For the one version that made it to the screen, there were dozens that got thrown out. Bottin pulled from the classics. A little C-3PO sleek look, a little of the Art Deco machine world of Metropolis, echoes of the great humanoid robots that came before, and even after he handed in finished, polished concepts, the job still wasn't done. Not even close. Because Verhoeven and writer Ed Neumeyer kept sending them back. Both were deep into Japanese manga at the time, chasing something more dynamic and over the top than what was in front of them. So Bottin would deliver a design, and then the notes would come back, and then he'd revise, and the whole loop would start over again. And again, and again, and again, and again. Those endless revisions became one of the biggest reasons that the suit showed up late to its own production. But nobody expects the next part. Years later, Verhoeven didn't pin the delay on Bottin, or bad luck, or the schedule. He actually pointed at himself. In his own words, "I'll take full responsibility for Bottin being late with the suit." The director admitted that he and his team had basically been sabotaging the one design that worked, chasing like a comic book fantasy that was in their heads. So the most iconic image in the whole movie, the one that ended up on posters, lunchboxes, action figures, and screens all around the world, well, that wasn't something that they nailed on the first try. or the 10th, or the 20th, or even 40th. It took about 50 swings and a director willing, eventually, to admit that he was the problem. And looking back, it was worth every single rejected sketch. And there you have it, everyone. 15 weird facts about RoboCop, a movie that survived endless redesigns, ratings board battles, accidental explosions, a fired lead actor, and a suit so uncomfortable that its star had to drive around in his underwear. In other words, making RoboCop was almost as dangerous as living in old Detroit. Which of these caught you off guard? And which RoboCop fact did we miss? Well, drop it in the comments, give the video a like, and subscribe to our channel. And until next time, thank you for your cooperation. This is Remember When.